Gray. That's the first thing you'd have noticed if you'd been standing on the deck of the USS Missouri that morning. Not the color of the ship or the uniforms. The sky. Flat gray, the kind that sits low over water without breaking, without giving you any sense of depth or distance, just gray all the way down to where it met Tokyo Bay. It was 8:56 in the morning. September 2nd, 1945. You would have heard them before you saw them clearly. Footsteps on the gangway, measured, deliberate. No hesitation in the rhythm, but no hurry either. 11 men coming across in two groups. Military officers first, high collars and dress uniforms. Rows of medals catching what little light came through the overcast. Then the civilians, dark suits, some with top hats they carried rather than wore. If you were one of the hundreds of American sailors and officers lining the upper decks, you would have been standing in complete silence. Not ordered silence, the kind where someone might still cough or shift their weight. True silence. The kind that happens when several hundred men decide on their own that this moment doesn't need their voices. You could hear the water against the hull. You could hear the lines creaking. You could hear those footsteps. The officers in that first group wore their uniforms the way men wear formal clothes to a funeral. Everything correct, nothing out of place. Faces arranged into something that wasn't quite an expression. Stillness, that's what their faces showed. Not anger, not shame, not grief. Just a kind of practiced blankness that made you understand, even if you'd never studied Japanese military culture, that what you were seeing was the only form of dignity these men had left. Several of them carried swords at their hips. Ceremonial, polished, the kind of detail that made the whole thing feel stranger. They were walking onto an American battleship in Tokyo Bay to sign documents ending a war their country had lost, and they were carrying swords. The deck had been arranged. You would have noticed that if you'd been paying attention to anything other than the men crossing toward the table. A long table, green cloth, documents already laid out, microphones positioned at specific angles, flags, the placement of every officer, every witness, every chair, all of it had been decided in advance. General Douglas MacArthur wasn't on deck yet. The ceremony wouldn't start without him. So for a few minutes, there was just the waiting. The Japanese delegation standing in formation near the table. The American officers and sailors watching from every level above. The water moving against the hull. The gray sky pressing down. Nobody talks much about those minutes. The accounts focus on what happened after MacArthur arrived, after the signing started. But if you'd been there, those minutes would have been the longest. Standing on the deck of a battleship in enemy waters, watching 11 men stand perfectly still in front of a table they hadn't chosen, waiting for a ceremony they couldn't stop. If this kind of story interests you, the ones that put you in the actual moment rather than just summarizing it, I try to bring one every week. Subscribe if that sounds worthwhile. MacArthur came on deck at 9 o'clock exactly. You would have recognized him immediately, even if you'd never seen a photograph. The way he walked, long strides, no wasted movement. The khaki uniform, open collar, no tie. The pipe he wasn't smoking but carried anyway. He walked to the microphone, looked out over the assembled delegation, and the watching officers on every level above. And when he spoke, his voice was flat and deliberate. The parties would now execute the formal surrender. No ceremony, no introduction. Just the statement of what was about to happen. The Japanese delegates had been positioned in front of the table. What you would have seen, if you'd been watching their faces, was nothing. The same stillness they'd carried across the gangway, the same rigid correctness. These were men who had been trained their entire professional lives to control what their faces showed, and they were showing you nothing. Behind MacArthur stood two men you might not have recognized unless you'd followed the war closely from the beginning. General Jonathan Wainwright, tall, gaunt, visibly older than his 59 years. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the British officer who'd surrendered Singapore in 1942. Both men had spent years in Japanese prison camps. Both men were standing 6 feet behind MacArthur as the Japanese delegation prepared to sign. If you'd known who they were, if you'd known what the camps had been like, you would have understood why they were standing there. This wasn't random placement. This was deliberate. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu approached the table first. He walked with a cane, his leg injured years earlier in an assassination attempt. Sitting down took him longer than it should have. Then he sat there, looking at the documents in front of him, not moving, not signing, just looking. The silence stretched. 30 seconds, 40, a minute. You would have felt it. That specific uncomfortable tension of watching someone hesitate in front of something they have no choice about. Shigemitsu kept looking at the documents, his hand on the pen but not writing. MacArthur's voice came from a few feet away, sharply quiet. Just a few words to General Richard Sutherland, his chief of staff. Show him where to sign. Sutherland moved to the table. Pointed. The hesitation ended. Shigemitsu signed. General Yoshijiro Umezu came to the table next. He didn't sit. He stood, leaned forward over the documents, signed his name in the posture of a man who intended to make it clear through body language alone that he was performing an administrative task, not an act of submission. His back was perfectly straight. His face, if you'd been close enough to see it, showed nothing. No grief. No humiliation. No acknowledgement of the men standing across from him, or the ship he was standing on, or the harbor surrounding that ship. He finished his signature, straightened up, and stepped back. What happened next took 23 minutes and involved representatives from 9 allied nations signing in sequence. You would have stood there through all of it if you'd been on that deck. The United States, the Republic of China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand, each man approached the table. Each man signed. The documents moved from one side to the other. The Japanese delegation stood where they'd been told to stand and watched it happen. What you would have noticed, if you'd been watching carefully, is that at no point did any of the Japanese officers bow. Not to MacArthur, not to the Allied representatives, not in any formal ceremonial way that their military culture might have demanded in other circumstances. They stood, they signed, they remained standing. If you'd expected some visible moment of submission, some physical gesture that marked the transfer of authority, you didn't get it. What you got instead was 11 men standing on the wrong side of a table on an American battleship in Tokyo Bay, signing documents that ended the war, while hundreds of men who had fought that war watched in silence. There was no drama, no raised voices, no confrontation, just signatures on paper and the sound of pens scratching and the flat gray sky pressing down over everything. MacArthur spoke again when the signing was complete. He said something about peace, about prayer, about God preserving what had been restored. The words were formal, the kind of thing you say at a ceremony, because the ceremony requires words. Then it was over. The Japanese delegation was escorted from the deck. They walked back across the gangway the same way they'd come. Measured steps, controlled faces, swords still at their hips. You would have watched them go. You would have stood there in the silence as they disappeared from view. And you would have tried to process what you'd just witnessed, because it wasn't what you expected, probably. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where the defeated party fell to their knees, or begged for mercy, or showed any visible sign of the collapse of everything they'd fought for. What there was instead was something harder to describe. A group of men standing in a place they didn't want to be, doing something they didn't want to do, with no choice about any of it, while the entire physical environment, the ship, the harbor, the flag, the position of every witness, communicated the same message without anyone needing to say it out loud. You lost. This is what losing looks like. General Umezu had kept his face blank and his back straight and his bearing correct through the entire ceremony. It didn't matter. He'd still signed his name under an instrument of surrender on the deck of an American battleship. The composure didn't change what the signature meant. If you're hooked on this, if you want more stories that put you in the room where it actually happened, make sure you subscribe. Turn on notifications. I'll keep finding them if you'll keep listening. What happened after the ceremony is worth understanding because it shows you what the ceremony actually was. Not an ending, a beginning. MacArthur moved his headquarters into Tokyo the same week. He set up in a building directly across from the Imperial Palace, a deliberate choice. Every morning, Japanese citizens walking past the palace could see Supreme Commander's headquarters on the opposite side of the moat. The occupation had started. Umezu, the general who'd signed with his back straight and his face correct, was arrested in December. He was charged before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The trial ran for 2.5 years. He was convicted in November 1948. Life sentence. He died in Sugamo prison 3 months later of cancer. 4 years from the deck of the Missouri to a prison cell to a grave. Shigemitsu, the foreign minister, who'd hesitated over the documents, was also tried. 7-year sentence. He was released in 1950, eventually returned to politics, served again as foreign minister in the 1950s. His path was different. The civilian diplomat versus the military officer. The tribunal saw the distinction. History saw it too. But on the morning of September 2nd, standing on that deck, both men were just the defeated, placing their signatures where they were told. The photographs taken that morning show you everything. The delegation arriving, the men at the table, the posture, the faces, the specific physical reality of people. In a situation they cannot control and cannot escape. Their faces are controlled. Their uniforms are correct. The ceremony is proceeding on terms they didn't set. MacArthur designed it that way. Every detail, the height of the table, the position of the witnesses, the presence of Wainwright and Percival standing behind him, the order of signatures, the angle of the cameras. He built a ceremony that couldn't be rewritten. If you'd been a Japanese officer standing on that deck, you could have maintained your composure, kept your face blank, performed every ritual of dignity your culture gave you. None of it would have changed what was happening. The war was ending. The authority was changing hands. The empire was surrendering. The record was being created in real time, in front of hundreds of witnesses, in photographs that would run in every newspaper in the world the next morning. You couldn't rewrite it later. You couldn't claim it had been something other than what it was. That's what MacArthur understood. The ceremony wasn't about behavior. It was about creating a record so complete, so photographed, so witnessed, that no one could spend the next 20 years claiming the army hadn't really been defeated. Germany's military had done exactly that after 1918. Spent 2 decades building the myth of the undefeated army betrayed from within. MacArthur had studied that. He had no intention of giving Japan's military the same opportunity, so he built a ceremony that left no gaps. The Allied aircraft came over just as the ceremony concluded. Hundreds of them, B-29s, carrier planes, formations that had been timed to arrive at exactly that moment. The sound reached the deck a few seconds after the planes were visible through the grey, a roar that filled the entire bay, then it faded. The harbor went quiet again. If you'd been standing on that deck as the Japanese delegation walked away and the planes disappeared and the silence returned, you would have understood something that no speech or document could have communicated. It was over. 4 years of war across 9,000 miles of ocean. The island campaigns, the jungle fighting, the carrier battles, the fire bombings, the 2 atomic weapons dropped on cities. All of it had come down to 23 minutes on the deck of a battleship in Tokyo Bay, 11 men signing documents, several hundred men watching. A grey sky pressing down over everything. And when it was finished in a way that couldn't be undone or rewritten or claimed to be something other than what it had been, complete, irrevocable. Witnessed. Wainwright, the general who'd spent more than 3 years in Japanese prison camps, stood on that deck and watched the men who'd held him sign the papers that ended it. He was 59 years old. He'd lost 60 pounds in captivity. He'd survived. MacArthur had made sure he was standing exactly where the Japanese delegation would see him. The message required no translation. The ceremony ended. MacArthur stepped back from the microphone. The Japanese delegation left the ship. The witnesses dispersed. Somewhere in the harbor, the water kept moving against the hulls of 100 vessels. The gray sky stayed gray. The morning became afternoon. The war was over. If you'd been there, standing on that deck in the silence after the planes faded, that's what you would have felt. Not triumph exactly, not celebration. Just the simple, enormous fact of an ending that had finally arrived. 23 minutes, 11 signature, one document that changed everything. That's what September 2nd, 1945, looked like if you were actually there.